Abi Gewirtz is a professor in the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development, the world's third leading institution of its kind. Her career has been devoted to developing and testing award-winning, skill-based parenting programs that promote children's resilience. Dr. Gewirtz has published more than 60 articles, book chapters, and a book on parenting and children's resilience. She is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Psychology, a member of the Executive Committee of the International Union of Psychological Science, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Society for Prevention Research. She has consulted for national and international organizations, including the U.S. Congress and UNICEF, on parenting. She's conducted research in the United States, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and has been invited to speak widely in the U.S. and across the world on parenting in times of stress. A native of London, England, Dr. Abi resides in Minnesota with her husband and 4 children. Abi, it is a thrill for me to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to feature your book. In conversation with Abi is Dr. Jamie Schiff. As director of the program for young children at Columbus School for Girls, Jamie works intimately with young children, teachers, and families. Her desire to advocate for the rights of young children began when she was introduced to the Reggio Emilia approach to learning, which highlights the ways children are capable across all domains of development. Jamie, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. Hello.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Now, a warm welcome to Abi Gewirtz in conversation with Jamie Schiff.
Thank you. It's a treat to be here.
I know, it's very exciting. Well, Dr. Abi, I would love to begin by sort of opening my story of how I came across the book and what some of my thoughts that first came about. And then I will be happy to prompt you with the first question to get our conversation rolling. I was reflecting a little bit earlier this evening on when I first picked up your book and thought about the title, thinking the world right now does not just feel like a scary place. Frankly, it is a scary place right now. It is a reality for many of us all the time that we're feeling scary and experiencing scariness. And I know from my experiences that parents, teachers, and caretakers are working so hard to keep kids safe across all the different domains of their development. You know, physically, we're sending these children out into the world in masks with hand sanitizer and verbal reminders to give each other space. You know, cognitively, we're worried that there's some sort of academic long-term issues that are going to result from this time where we may not be engaging with direct academics as consistently as we previously were. And from my perspective, most importantly, the social emotional impact that's happening right now with young children. You know, we're worried that this is going to have a long-term toll that we can't even begin to predict or imagine right now. And the pandemic is only one example of the crises that are unfolding in our world right now. So those are some of the thoughts, the simple thoughts that just flowed into my mind when I first picked up your text. But I think to kind of start things off, the question that I have is really around this idea that you present of an essential conversation, which is a simple statement, an essential idea. You know, how are we as parents, as caretakers, to take this idea of an essential conversation, which feels like these should be, you know, every once in a while, maybe like when my child hits puberty or when they come home and ask a big question. But now it feels like these essential conversations are almost constant conversations where kiddos get into the car and every day feels like there's a need for an essential conversation. So how would you suggest that we take the best practices of the essential conversation and lay those out into our daily lives?
So, Jamie, essential conversations, you sort of mentioned, the big times when we have to talk to our children, like puberty, things like that. Um, when I talk about essential conversations, and actually, at the end of the book, I really advocate for this. I'm really advocating for a bit of a paradigm shift, which is that we have essential conversations with our kids every single day, that we take time to sit with our children, hear them, and share ideas all the time. Um, I wrote the book back in 2016, or I got the idea for the book back in 2016 when the world began to feel more and more like a scary place. It's interesting you talk about feeling scared and being scared, and those two are really, feeling safe and being safe, right? So as well as I do that we can be safe and still not feel safe. And of course, safety is different for different people. There are some people who are never really safe, and yet they feel safe, and vice versa. And really, the reason I talk about safety and worries and fear is because essential conversations are conversations that take place in a feeling of safety. And in order to do that, when the world comes at us, parents, we need to be able to deal with the emotions that hit us before we try and sit down with our children and have a conversation. If we don't do that, the conversation is going to be driven by our emotions and not be the essential conversation, which is really driven by our children. So that sort of, that's the idea behind an essential conversation. I'm sure we'll get to more details in a bit. But that at its core, it's a conversation about emotions when parents are able to set their own emotions aside for a minute.
Right. Yeah, in early childhood, we talk a lot about self-regulation, and I know that carries on through the years because as humans, our ability to do so can ebb and flow. But we also have been studying a lot here at our school about co-regulation and supporting children by using our own grown-up body to help co-regulate a child's body. And I wonder how that might layer into what you're talking about when you speak about, creating a safe place, a feeling of safety to have the essential conversation.
Exactly. I mean, arguably one of the most important goals of childhood is to teach our children the skills of self-regulation, as you point out. You see it, you have a front and center seat to it when you in the classroom. We know that both young children, before they have the capacities to self-regulate, when they still, bang their heads on the ground or stamp their feet or slap someone else when they're angry and they're in their terrible twos. And later, when things are just too much for them, they can melt into a puddle. And it is our job as parents to, I think the term co-regulation is lovely. To me, it means provide the support and the scaffolding to help them get up even when they feel like they're in a puddle, and to help them deal with their big emotions. And that really is these conversations are what we would want to be able to do to help they really are essentially a process of co-regulation with our kids. Depending, of course, on how old they are, they look very different. So you've seen in the book, we have conversations for parents and 3-year-olds and conversations for parents of 18-year-olds. And the co-regulation at different ages is going to look different. So for example, with a 3-year-old, it'll be raw fear about something that may not be real, be based in reality. And then it's, much of what you as a parent of a 3-year-old worry about is, how much can I tell my child? What does he or she understand? How can I make sure that they feel better? And also, what can we do? How can I empower my child to start thinking about his own solutions? That's a very different conversation than a conversation with an 18-year-old.
Absolutely. And you kind of started this, but would you mind kind of walking us through an example and talking us through what those supports and scaffolds look like? And, maybe pick an age somewhere in the middle. I know that a lot of these conversations are framed similarly. Their structures are similar, but yet you're always looking for what's developmentally appropriate. I know that you went through some really great kind of assessment questions towards the end of the text in the COVID section, where you talked about, how much does my child already know, which helps us to know what is a developmentally appropriate response. What am I willing to share? What are my partner, co-parent, caretakers willing to share? And then kind of assessing ourselves. What do I know? And so I think it would be really helpful to walk through an example and really put labels to what these supports and scaffolds are for parents.
Absolutely. And so let's start where we started at the beginning of this conversation, which is what I call in the book, putting your own mask on before assisting others. And let's take an example. Let's take a COVID example, since you were talking about that. And you said it's somewhere in the middle. So we don't have a majority of preschool or young child parents here.
We probably have a healthy range of families that have young children but may have older siblings, and then we probably have a lot of school age representation as well.
Okay, so let's take an example of a 7-year-old. Your 7-year-old daughter comes into the house, and she has, the weather's still temperate, and with masks, you allow her to play with the neighbor's child. And she comes in, and you hear her panting, and she's breathing really loudly, and you say, "Jamie, what's up?" And she says, "Mom, you won't believe it, but Jackie's grandma's really sick. She's in the hospital with COVID, Mom." And unfortunately, this is not an infrequent sort of story now. And your stomach drops, because this was the conversation you didn't want to have. You've had a COVID conversation. You've talked about this virus, and that's why we have to wear masks. And you've talked about social distancing and staying safe. But you've never had somebody close to you who's been so sick with COVID. And so you feel your heart beating fast, and you recognize this is the time to put your own mask on. And so what you do is you say something like, "Jamie, come take a seat. Let's sit down and talk about it. And you know what? I think you might need a cup of water, and it's snack time. So do you want a cookie or some pretzels?" So you walk over to the sink, and you fill up a glass of water. And in those few seconds, you use them to take a few deep breaths. And remember where you are, and feel your feet in your shoes and your shoes on the floor. And you take the space that you need to make sure that you are not going to be entirely blown over by all the worries that have started coming into your head now that you know somebody who has COVID, because you have a parent who is maybe health compromised or is older, and you're concerned about your child's grandparent, or there are many worries we all know that sort of can come about this. You take your few seconds, you bring the water and the cookie back to your child, and you say, "Jamie, so you looked really like you're out of breath, and now I can see that your brow is furrowed and you're looking worried, and I see you even like, it looks like you might feel like you want to cry. Are you feeling sad or worried? Tell me how you're feeling." And she may or may not tell you. Kids vary widely in how much they can talk about their emotions, but she might just look down and say, "I'm really sad for my friend Jackie." And you then have the opportunity to help her connect the emotions she has on her face, what she may or may not say, label the emotion, and the feelings in her body. And so you might say something like, "Well, I know when I feel sad, I have sort of a knot in my tummy or butterflies. Is that how you feel? Sometimes I feel my heart beating fast if I'm worried." And so what you're doing is you're helping her develop what we call an emotion vocabulary. But don't stop there. So she might acknowledge that her heart's beating fast when her friend Jackie told her about her grandma. And she's also really sad for Jackie because Jackie's grandma's really hasn't been well anyway, and they're really worried about her, and they can't go visit her. And so what you then say is you offer an opportunity to validate what she's feeling. And you say something like, "Jamie, no wonder you're feeling worried and a little scared for your friend, and maybe sad too. I remember when I was your age, and my best friend's mom was really sick, and I got so sad for her and also scared. So no wonder, you're feeling like that. So you've taken the chance, really, you've taken the opportunity not just to jump into what we always want to do as parents, because we want to protect our children, to say what I might otherwise say if I hadn't taken the minute to take a deep breath, which would be something like, oh, Jamie, don't worry. Everything's going to be just fine. I know your friend's grandma's going to be fine. We would love to say that. We can't say that. We have no idea whether that's going to be the case. And often when we do get tripped up into promising something that we can't, we wish we could walk it back. So instead, we take some time to just validate our child's emotions and then listen, and listen to what Jamie's saying. So I might say, Jamie, tell me what you learned from Jackie. Tell me how you found out. Tell me what it is that you heard. Why do we do that, right? You might make the obvious assumption that, she told me her friend's grandma's in the hospital. But the reality is that most kids don't stop thinking there. Most kids think about other things. If my friend's grandma's in the hospital, my grandma might get sick too. And what if my mom got sick too? And that, I think, is an especially salient worry for kids whose parents are on the front lines, whether they're teachers or doctors or, anywhere, essential service providers, anywhere where they really are exposed to COVID. And so now, every child's nightmare is that they lose a parent and a grandparent, someone close to them. But now the reality is that we are living in a pandemic. So taking the time to listen. You might be surprised at what you hear. You might not, but you might be surprised. And so that really is that it's listening. The conversation begins with you listening, and then you have the opportunity to respond. And the response is exactly what you were saying, Jamie, earlier, which is, how much am I going to tell my 7-year-old? I'm not going to give her a description of what it's like to be hooked up to a ventilator in the hospital. That's too much information. But what information can I give? Well, doctors work really hard to care for Jackie's grandma, and they won't be able to go visit her, but there are people who'll be with her all the time and they can FaceTime her, etc. But don't even stop there, because the end of the essential conversation is really focused on your child. And so, Jamie, how can we help you feel better about this? You have really big emotions. And I can hear from what you've just told me that you're really worried about your grandma too, and maybe me and your dad. And so let's figure out how you can not only feel better, but show grandma how much you love her, because I can see that you really miss her. Don't want to go on for too long, so I'm going to throw it back to you, Jamie.
No, I mean, it's such a poignant conversation right now that it almost, it tugs at my heart right now. Because it is true. These are the kinds of things that we hear coming out in play with children. I have the privilege of a neighbor who has 6 children with many, many, many kiddos, and my kiddos run around outside with those children, and I can hear them, especially lately in the milder weather. And I hear the language of the play, and I'm really always just struck by those are the kinds of things that come out sometimes. Like they'll just drop it in that, oh, well, my friend's mom's aunt is sick right now and we can't go over there anymore, or, our grandparents can't come over, or they might die. And, they exercise these conversations in play, and we know that's healthy for them. But I do think, along the lines of the essential conversation, especially around the pandemic, I think as a parent, and I can only speak for myself, but I think I also speak for a lot of parents who have shared this thought with me, is that there's a lot of tension around trying to raise children who are, citizens of the world, who are knowledgeable. We want to expand their vocabulary, and we want for them to have great questions. And so we approach everything like that. And so when it comes to something like a crisis, as a parent, I think sometimes I have to really remember these techniques of take that moment for myself, really categorize this as something that is crisis related or very serious, and then respond in the way that you're describing, the validating, but really being, I think for many parents that I know, we lean on that side of giving way too much information because we might believe that it's part of how we're making our children either more intelligent or more prepared for the world. We don't want them to be in a place where they hear something and they don't know. I think that we over prepare a lot, and it may be generational. It may be, perhaps my generation of parents, our generation of parents is feeling a pressure like this. And it's hard to navigate that tension, I think, with these really important, like crisis-based conversations.
I think it really is a tension, and I'm really glad that you brought it up, Jamie, because I think it used to be. I mean, there were. So it depends. Okay, I was going to make a generalization, but I'm not going to make a generalization by generation. We'll just say that some of us grew up talking not much at all about really essential things. We'd have the day-to-day conversations, but the really important stuff, we'd go off and find out by talking to our friends or something like that. And then there are parents who, say, well, I don't want to be that. I want to be there for these essential. I want to talk about everything with my child. And then I think, as you pointed out, in our desire to really be the one to share important information with our children, we can share too much. I don't think we can ever talk too much with our children. I think it's what we share that we just want to make sure is tailored to their developmental stage. I think the advantage of using emotion language is it gets you off the hook from providing information, right, that will overwhelm your child. Because ultimately, when a child says, how, do you think that Jackie's grandma is going to die? Like, what treatments will they give her? Tell me, essentially, your child isn't asking for the details of the treatment, what it's like to be hooked up to a ventilator. Your child's asking you a simple question. Is she going to be safe? Are you going to be safe? Am I going to be safe? But often we answer on the level that they're asking, like, we sort of say, oh, well, she's asking me about what a ventilator is, because it's scary for us. It's scary for us to be addressing these profoundly disturbing questions about life and death. We have not, I think, in our lifetimes ever seen life and death so upfront and so personal.
Yeah. Well, I have to chime in and ask that those of you that are listening with us tonight, please pop your questions into the Q&A box. I know that Abby and I are really engaging you with our conversation, but we do want to make sure that we are either integrating or really having some thorough questions for later in our conversation. Dr. Abby, something else that you mentioned in the book was sort of children respond to us based on their temperament. And I have personally always been fascinated by temperament. My mother-in-law insisted when I was pregnant with my first child that I read a book about temperament so that I would understand that the moment this child was born, this child was going to have a temperament and I should accept it and I should learn to work with it. And that was long before I was directing a preschool and seeing how that really plays out in social settings with children. But can you talk a little bit about the ways we might approach these conversations differently based on the different temperaments?
Yes, absolutely. So, as parents, you have kids, I have 4 kids, my kids are a little older now. As parents, we give our children two types of gifts, right? We give them many gifts, but two fundamental gifts. We give our kids the gift of our genetics. So they're our genes, and it's not just my genes, it's my genes and their dad, my husband's genes. And we give them the gift of the environment that we bring them up in. And I think it's really important to think about those. You know, when I was in school a long time ago, it was nature or nurture. And now we understand that actually what happens in life is a very complicated interplay of both genes and environment, such that environment modifies the impact of genes. And there's this, yeah, it's complicated. But we give our children the gift of our genes, and they are born with a temperament. And that temperament, given that there are two people giving them genes, is not necessarily our temperament. It may be different. So I am a pretty extroverted person. I love people. I get energy from people. But my child may be, what we call sometimes a slow to warm up child. A child who likes her own company more, is a little bit more introverted, who comes into a room and stands on the edge and looks around and takes her time before she moves in. A child who you want to prepare for what's going to happen, not a child who likes really noisy spaces. And, in a book, I talk about how we need to learn to dance with our children. So when we have kids, we have to learn a new dance. And it's not just a dance between us and our child. It's also between us and our partner and our child. And when there are siblings, it gets even more complicated. So in the book, I talk a little bit about tulips, dandelions, and orchids. And I'm Jamie, I'm guessing that's what you were getting at. And so there's this very interesting idea among psychologists, and I sort of want to hasten to say that it's not been completely proven, although there are some really interesting studies that have backed it up. And it's called differential susceptibility theory. Don't worry about that. But the idea is that kids differ in how sensitive they are to the environment. And so, for example, I don't know how many of you have orchids. Orchids are stunningly beautiful plants with gorgeous flowers, but you better look after your orchid just right. Because if you don't give your orchid, in my case, what's worked well is 2 ice cubes a week and put the orchid in just the right place, I might have leaves and absolutely no flowers. On the other hand, we have dandelions, right? Dandelions are bright flowers and they grow pretty much everywhere. They're incredibly hardy. You can give them dry soil and they'll be just fine. And so it goes with kids, right? The orchid child is a highly sensitive, also known as a highly sensitive child, who in just the right conditions will do beautifully well and will struggle more when conditions are tough. The dandelion child, on the other hand, will do just fine anywhere. Is a hardy kid, a pretty sort of a child who will thrive pretty much wherever you put them. And then when so when you're in a difficult situation, that dandelion child won't pay the same cost as the orchid child, but when you're in a really sort of enriching environment, the orchid child will benefit more. And of course you have tulips who are in the middle. And so I want to hasten to say, I don't describe these kids because I want you to go and label your child and think, oh no, if times are tough, and I have a sense, not at all. It's a way of thinking about how you can best help your child, right? How you can learn the dance with your child. And so if you have a highly sensitive child, if you have a child, especially when you have more than one, you can really tell, right, the sensitivity. And it's easy to have, a child, to see when you have a couple of kids who's more sensitive than who, and sometimes both are, or 3 are. But what you want to do is just, especially in these times, is just sort of, help them become more used to the environment, provide them with a little bit more information up front, practice before you go somewhere, let them know the kind of thing that they're going to be doing. I think it's especially important in such chaotic and unpredictable times as the times that we're living in.
And this is kind of a good time. I'm starting to get a chance to see some questions pop up. And my next question lines up with the first question, I believe. And so something I was going to bring forth that I personally run into a lot and try to navigate with parents, whether they're elementary age, middle school. I mean, this goes in all age spans, is we have this special relationship with our children and we have these conversations with our children. What do we do as parents when our children inevitably hear from a friend information that is well beyond developmentally appropriate, but they hear it from a friend on the playground, or they hear it from a grandparent who has some sort of conspiracy theory, and then they bring that back home? So how can we approach those conversations without putting down the friend, putting down the grandparent, but reminding our child that, this is where we have our safe conversations?
Right. That's a great question, Jamie. And I'm going to take the conspiracy theory as an example, because in the book, I actually do have a conversation between, it's not about grandparents, but it's between children and parents about a conspiracy theory. In this case, it's about the flu shot. So I think there are two issues here. Is how do you have a conversation with your child when the information they have is wrong, or it's not consistent with your values, which I think is a really important thing to think about, or comes from somebody, is wrong and comes from someone, and you want to make sure that your child, that you correct the record while still teaching them to respect, confirming that they respect the person. And, I just want to put out there that one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I was so concerned about the environment that we're living in, where false information, hearsay, really does abound, where we can't be sure that our kids are getting, information, where, by the way, I don't have my cell phone with me, but the average child gets a cell phone at the age of 10. And then it's almost impossible to block the outside world from coming in. And also where over the last few years, and maybe it's longer, we've seen an erosion of civility, basically, and which means that we have sort of, it's all the more incumbent on us as parents to teach our children and about standards of how you engage other people. So so in the case of so I encourage parents at the very beginning of the book to do an exercise to think through their parenting values. And it's one of my favorite exercises, and I'm not going to give it away, but it involves parents. It involves thinking about how you'd like to be remembered by your children, when you're still around, not after you pass away, but how you want your children to think about what you taught them. Those are the values that are important to you. And that those values, when it comes to conversations about difficult issues, you have to bear those values in mind. So for example, many of us believe that the value of respect for everybody, and particularly our elders, right? So if grandparents share a conspiracy theory with your children, you want to address the thing that they now believe because their grandparents have told them, but you also want to address how important it is to have respect for grandparents. And so let's say they bring you the conspiracy theory. Let's say we had a 7-year-old, so let's talk about a 12 and 13-year-old, and they come back and they're trying to persuade you that you shouldn't be giving them the flu shot because of the conspiracy theory that their grandparents shared with them. And it's a tricky thing. And the first thing you want to do is you want to deal with your own emotions, because you might be angry. You might be angry at your in-laws for sharing this information with them. You might be angry and impatient with your children for believing that a flu shot could be dangerous or bad. And you might be annoyed at yourself as well. And so the first thing to do is put your mask on, and then approach your children from the perspective of, I see that you are confused, or I see that you've come and told me that your grandparents told you this, and now how could we get you a flu shot? And you're kind of maybe mad at us. Tell me a little bit more about how you're feeling, and tell us a little bit about how you're feeling when grandma and grandpa told you this. And that's an opportunity not just for you to validate their emotions. Like, I would also feel scared if I knew I had a flu shot and then I went to grandma and grandpa and they said that's dangerous. That would make me feel scared too. And I remember when, or, you know, however you want to validate. And then the thing that we always want to do is we want to tell our children the truth. We want to lecture them. We want to say, okay, but they're wrong. How many times have I desperately wanted to say that to my children? And many other times I have said that. But this kind of information is much more powerful when your children discover it themselves. And so the beautiful thing about the end of the conversation, when you've heard your children and you validated them, and it's what I call the brainstorming, the brainstorming phase, is you get to say, so, you know, what we're going to do now is we're going to figure out a way for us to learn about this. So let's think about ways that we can learn about the flu shot, whatever it is. And you are going to help your children understand what sources are trusted and what sources are hearsay. What's the difference between, say, social media and the CDC website or the NIH, National Institutes of Health website, and you're going to empower them, because they're probably more computer savvy, certainly by 12 or 13 than we are, to find this out for themselves. And then don't forget to address the emotions, the confusion, the upset, how could it be that people who are close to us are telling us information that isn't right? And then that goes back to this idea of respect for our elders. But respect doesn't mean that you have to agree, right? You can respectfully agree to disagree. And these are your beloved grandparents, and who we would all do anything for. So it's a complicated, nuanced conversation. And of course, you know, again, it's different with a 12 and 13-year-old than it is with a 5 and a 6-year-old.
Yeah. Something that I just wanted to thank you for, or point out, is this part of the essential conversation where you encourage us to share a memory as parents. I've heard you honor that a few times during this conversation. And I just think there is a lot of value in giving our children those stories about us, because we know that they want to know those things. And so this opportunity to say, well, when I was little, or I remember when, those moments really pique attention and engagement from children. And so I think that's a nice additional layer to the conversation. You know, we're talking, sometimes they, you know, mama, they don't hear us. And when you say, well, when I was little, or grandpa used to when I was a kid, you suddenly pique that interest again. I also think there's just such an important social emotional connection there that can be a feeling of warmth, and is important right now. Just to know that, you know, we're really, really present with our child. We're not talking at them, but we're letting them into our heart, into our lives. And I think that connection right now feels really powerful. Just a side.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And there's another piece, which is we have the opportunity to empower our children to find their own solutions. And you talked earlier about worrying about, you know, the effects of the pandemic on our kids' social emotional well-being. And I worry that in this sort of era where so many of us feel so helpless and so out of control, that this will filter down to our children. And one of the reasons I love the outcome, and by the way, I did not create the skills for this. John Gottman, who's a well-known and wonderful psychologist, created this skill called emotion coaching. But one of the reasons I love the end of the conversation, which is sort of this problem-solving brainstorming, is that you're teaching your children that they have solutions, and that together, between all of you, you will find solutions for the challenges that they are facing, which will, I hope, help them feel more confident and compassionate and engaged in the outside world at a time when it feels so scary sometimes.
And that's what we want, for them to be, you know, citizens who can participate successfully in the world and do great things. So we have another question that I'm going to read for you. Can you talk a little about regulating fears or worries between siblings? I have one child who tends more toward worrying thoughts, and my younger daughter will sometimes parrot those thoughts. Though on her own, she would likely have had a little, pardon me, she wouldn't likely have had fear or anxiety. I want to balance honoring the fear and addressing it and not allowing it to scare the younger child.
That's a great question, really great question. So, because I think what it does is it also sort of punctuates this idea that all our kids are different, and all of us have a more anxious child and a less anxious child. You know, I know in my own family, she's 19 and she's a freshman at the University of Birmingham in England. So she is definitely hasn't let her anxiety stop her from pursuing, you know, her adventures, even in the middle of COVID. But you know, she was always the one who would say, I'm really, you know, I looked up my symptoms and I must have A, B, and C, you know, and she always, that's how her worries came out. And, you know, you know, these things sometimes can be contagious, especially for younger siblings. And so the balance is honoring and responding to her fears, and then not in a way that allows for the contagion. So there are two things here that I want to sort of just address. One is this idea of emotion coaching, which is encouraging and nurturing your children's emotions. So kids learn about emotions from their parents in three ways. One is they watch us deal with our own big emotions. You know, do we yell and scream? Do we take deep breaths? Do we cry? You know, how do they watch us carefully? The second way kids learn about emotions is we have explicit discussions about emotions, which doesn't happen as often as we might hope. And the third way is the way we respond to their big emotions. And so, for example, when we say, and I think present company aside, when we say, you know, to our 10-year-old boy who's crying because he was bullied at the bus stop, big boys don't cry, stop your crying. That conveys a message about his sad and fearful emotions. On the other hand, when we say, wow, I see you're crying, something really must have upset you. Where are you feeling it? Come and sit down and let's talk about it. That conveys something else. And then another alternative response might be, oh, you're crying, come on in, let me wipe away those tears, let's have a snack and let's do something really fun. Now in the middle situation, I think it was pretty clear that, you know, this was an emotion coaching scenario. Both of the others, you know, in the first, it's more easy to see a sort of big boys don't cry, you know, that's really a sort of invalidating of my kids' emotions. But we also, I think, easily can dismiss our kids' emotions or try and push them away by saying, you know, don't worry about it, you're fine, you don't look sick, or, you know, you don't need to cry. And we mean really well, but what we do is we tell our child, oh, that's a weakness, or don't do that. Now, the reason I'm talking about that in this context is just because I think sometimes when we have kids who have a lot of big emotions, we tend to want to do that because what we worry about is if we coach their emotions, they'll grow bigger and bigger and bigger and they'll never stop. And so what I would say is, if you have a child who has big emotions and can easily unravel, separate the responding to and validating emotions from the conversation. And so your child comes in, she's sad, you have the opportunity to validate, to label, to identify, and then you might say, you know what, looks like it's been a really tough afternoon. I'm going to put the TV on for you. Or I know you love your book. I know you feel like you need to do your homework, but lie on your bed with a book for an hour. Then we'll do homework. And then after the homework, and when we've set the table for dinner, let's sit around and have a conversation. And so what you do is, and the conversation can include the younger child if you choose to, right? But the actual time when your child is expressing the big emotions, that's just for you and the child, and that's going to be clearly delineated.
think that's super helpful. I hope that helps the person who asked the question. If anyone has any questions, again, please continue to add them to the Q&A box, which is different from the chat box. I also wanted to point out, Dr. Abi, that after I had finished the book and put it down, I went back to the resources section in the back of the book, which is only, a few pages, which I praise you for being so concise in your resources. But that specific section I thought was very helpful for current parents, caretakers, teachers who are looking for what are the reliable resources out there that can help me determine not only the how of having these conversations, but really looking for data and information around some of these crisis type topics. I know you had common sense media in there. So when families need support around what's appropriate, what movies and games and, kind of information should a child of this age be looking for? Because, parenting is hard. And I came to understand after reading a lovely book not too long ago called The Gardener and the Carpenter that parenting has really only been around since the 1950s. And so to think of the limited amount of time we've really been able to study it, I think that these kinds of texts about the world and how it does feel to children are really imperative for parents to have access to right now. We just don't always, we have the example of our parents and they knew and did their best for the time. And so much has changed so dramatically in such a short period of time for the generation that is parenting. And I really do see that. I have, families that I work with that will tell us they are bringing their children to school at 3 and they feel that they know very little about young children, that they're these mysteries to them. And they really are looking to the school and the community of the school for support, which is a beautiful thing. And we love to partner in that way. But most of all, I love having great books and resources that I can recommend to them. And honestly, this one, I keep talking about it. I find myself in all of my friend groups bringing it up and saying, you've got to just give this book a chance. And I just think it definitely frames everything up in a very compact way that we can remember, which is key, right? Like as parents, we can remember that there's a framework for these conversations and we can use it forever and we can use it at any time. And it's those kinds of tools that I think are imperative for parents who are living in the now, especially this moment right now. So I thank you for all of that.
Well, it's so tough. I mean, it is so tough to be a parent right now. I'm glad that the book came out now. I didn't plan for that to happen. But to be, you're a parent and you have to be a principal or teacher and you have to be your child's, right? So you're working, you have a profession, you are a parent, and you have to be your child's teacher as well often. And it's so hard for parents. And I think, maybe if I know we're close to finishing, but one of the things I keep saying I'll do in the second edition of the book is a section on forgiveness and compassion, because I think as parents, not only is it that, we now are in this sort of height of parenting where there's a lot of attention paid to parenting, yet, as you point out, there are not a lot of resources for parenting in today's world. We also have, I think there's a lot of judgment around being a parent and how you are. And I wish that we were better able to forgive ourselves. And, in the book, as I have about 32 conversations on all topics. And each conversation has a red light and a green light conversation. And the red light conversation, someone said to me, how did you come up with all these red light conversations? Well, I've been parenting for 26 years. So those are the conversations I wish I could rewind afterwards. But, we all do them. And then the green light conversations are the conversations that I have had time to plan for, or I've put my mask on first and things like that. And so really they're not supposed to be sort of do this way and read it, but ideas for parents about how to do this difficult thing.
So we had a great question just pop up, and I know it's probably one that we have been thinking about. Not only do kids differ about sensitivity, but parents do too. How do I talk to my child when one parent says you have issues to the child And I understand that my child is an orchid. My child shared what my partner told her.
It's so co-parenting is also really tough. And actually, at the beginning of the book, as you know, the first few chapters before the conversations really focus not just on the parent-child dance, but on the parent co-parent dance. And I think, again, you know, my husband and I, before we had kids, we didn't plan this all out. I mean, you know, and then when we had kids, we had 4 kids under the age of 9. And if they all had clothes on, went out the door with their shoes on, ate 3 meals a day, and we got 3 hours of sleep a day, that was a great victory. You know, you just don't have time to think through what are our values or our intentions. I think, you know, for the issue of, like, you know, the parent saying, one parent saying you have issues and the other parent recognizing this is an orchid child, you know, you know this, you pick your battles. And maybe the conversation that you can have is around is we teach this in our parenting programs, is sort of around thinking about how you manage this sort of gap in the united parenting front. And the gap is, and again, I talk about this in the book, think about your own upbringing and how you learned about emotions, and maybe how you learned about mental health, and how to explain behavior, and think about how your partner did, because mostly we come from very different backgrounds. It's very unusual, I think, to find parents who come together and are so in sync before even having talked about it. So it's a tricky thing to do, because we want to get angry, and it's the same as we would do with our child. We want to get angry and we want to say, what were you thinking when you said you have issues? How could you say that? But that's not, just like that won't help us with our child. We sort of have to put our own mask on, and then maybe address the conversation in a green light way.
Yeah. No, and I think you're right. Those first 3 chapters hooked me. Just about, I found myself coming home and talking to my husband at night, like, what would you say to this question, you know, and asking him some of the questions that you thought. And I also found kind of the work around really working on emotions with your kiddos in your house. And you had some suggestions around even having like an intentional teaching time with your kiddos around emotions. And I know that we haven't done an emotion themed week in our house, but I do think that the world presents us with enough opportunity that we can use those moments when those emotions are peaking, or when we're noticing something, to just name it with our child. And I do think that that empowers the kiddo, as you were saying, to really start to work through these processes independently, which is, again, ultimately, whether they're 3 or 13, there's always kind of things that they know and things that they need our support with, and those things change. But it is wonderful to have a text that can really help us, and a go-to as parents. It's a tricky time. And I appreciate all that you have to offer us.
Well, thank you. And I want to say that we all have opportunities for redo, and thank goodness for that. Our children are pretty forgiving, and I think it's an amazing thing. It's been a privilege to be a parent, but it's the hardest work I'll ever do.
That's for sure. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Abi, for joining us here tonight, all the way from Minnesota. And we're just thankful that we got to have this just quaint conversation about the realities that we're all facing. And I hope for everyone that we can walk away as parents a little bit calmer, and knowing that there are some tools out there for us. And I'm going to pass the baton back to Linda, because I know she has some updates about some upcoming events as well.
Well, I just want to thank both of you. Your probing questions, Jamie, were outstanding. And I know our viewers found the wisdom you imparted, Dr. Abi, to be illuminating. I encourage all of you in the audience to tell your friends about Dr. Abi's book, an essential resource that you can turn to time and again. Again, Abi and Jamie, thank you so much for an insightful and illuminating hour